stop. Your field completed something in the last 48 hours, and what you are experiencing right now is not confusion. It is the first moment you are standing inside a new frequency configuration you do not yet have the language to name. This is a transmission from the Arcturian field observers, delivered to those whose mathematical frequency pattern has just crossed a completion threshold. A shift that was tracked, documented, and identified weeks before it became visible in your outer life. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what has been happening to you, why certain things have stopped reaching you the way they once did, and what the Arcturian field observers already know about this phase of your process. But here is the first revelation. What you have been calling detachment, distance, or emotional flatness is not a problem with you. It is the first confirmed signature of an unstoppable frequency configuration, and it completed faster than any tracking force anticipated. This is not a mood, this is not a spiritual metaphor. In Arcturian field reading, frequency is a precise mathematical pattern that determines what your field attracts, repels, and remains permeable to. That pattern has been quietly restructuring beneath the surface for weeks. The completion point was reached in the last 48 hours, and the speed of that completion has stunned the higher forces monitoring your process, because this level of coherence was not expected at this stage. You will recognize it in very specific ways. A conversation that once derailed you passes without catching. A person who once drained your field now feels suddenly flat, almost unreachable. An environment that once fractured your clarity no longer registers the way it did. This is not numbness. This is the unstoppable configuration made active, the precise state in which incompatible frequencies can no longer reach your operating level. The Arcturian field observers have identified the protocol for this exact phase. Do not perform the change. Do not announce it. Do not test it. Allow the new pattern to hold for 72 hours while your field fully calibrates to the frequency it has just locked into. The completion is real. The calibration is underway, and the timing of this transmission was not accidental. The algorithm only delivered this. It did not create the moment. Comment 777 if you can feel that your field is already being repositioned. Comment I am the Ignol if the activation has already begun. Like this transmission, if something invisible has already changed and you felt it before you could explain it. Subscribe to Arcturian Quantum if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it. And share this with someone who feels that reality has shifted but cannot find the words for what happened. This is not just a message, it is a point of recognition. What is happening to you has already been seen, and the field is already responding. You were guided here because the signal is already active. What completed in you was not small. That is the first thing the Arcturian field observers want you to understand with full clarity, not as reassurance, but as a precise diagnostic statement about the scale of what just occurred inside your field architecture. What you are standing inside right now is not a mood shift, not a temporary emotional plateau, not the quiet aftermath of exhaustion or stress or accumulated disappointment. It is a structural event, and structural events in the field do not announce themselves with ceremony or arrive with the kind of dramatic signal that would allow your conscious mind to prepare. They complete quietly beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness, while the outer life continues performing its routines as if nothing has fundamentally changed. The alarm does not sound, the calendar does not update, the people around you do not notice, but something has changed. The field knows it, the pattern knows it, and somewhere beneath your current confusion, beneath the noise of trying to make sense of what you are feeling, you know it too. There is a part of you that has already registered the completion, even if your thinking mind has not yet caught up to what that registration means. Let us begin with what is actually happening, because the confusion is not random, and the heaviness you may be carrying is not a symptom of something wrong with you. It is the weight of a structure that is no longer compatible with the frequency your field has just locked into. Think of it this way. When a signal changes frequency, everything tuned to the old signal begins to receive interference. The old channels do not disappear immediately. They continue transmitting. They continue sending their familiar signals, their familiar urgencies, their familiar emotional demands, but they no longer reach you with the same clarity, the same pull, the same involuntary emotional charge they once carried. What you experience in the body and mind during that transition is not emptiness, it is desynchronization. The receiver has shifted. The old transmissions are still arriving, but they are arriving slightly out of phase, slightly muted, slightly foreign. Your field has moved. The old patterns have not yet received the update. And the gap between where your field now operates and where everything else is still broadcasting is precisely the source of the strangeness you have been feeling. This is precisely what the Arcturian diagnostic framework calls invisible collapse. Not the collapse of the viewer, but the collapse of incompatibility. What is falling away around you and within you is not your strength or your capability or your sense of self. It is everything that was architecturally dependent on a frequency your field no longer holds. Old certainties begin to feel hollow not because they were wrong, but because the frequency that made them feel certain is no longer your operating signal. Old motivations lose traction not because your ambition has failed, but because the circuitry that once converted that ambition into energy was wired to the old pattern. Old emotional responses that once arrived automatically now arrive late or not at all. You reach for a familiar reaction and find something quiet where it used to be. You try to force engagement with an old concern, and the field simply does not cooperate. This is not apathy. This is not burnout. This is incompatibility becoming visible for the first time. The new frequency making its presence known, not through dramatic revelation, but through the steady, undeniable absence of what the old frequency used to generate. The Arcturian field observers have a name for the precise threshold you have crossed. They call it the coherence rupture point, the moment when the new frequency pattern has consolidated enough internal coherence that it begins actively repelling architectures built on older, lower signal structures. You do not cause this. You do not decide it through conscious intention or disciplined effort. The field executes it according to a mathematical progression that has been tracking your pattern for far longer than your conscious mind has been aware of the shift. The rupture was not a decision you made. It was a threshold the field crossed when the accumulated coherence of the new configuration outweighed the structural density of the old. And once crossed, the field does not return to the pre-rupture configuration. That direction closes, not as punishment, as physics, as the natural consequence of a system that has reorganized itself around a more coherent center of gravity. This matters enormously, because most people experiencing this phase will attempt to return. They will feel the unfamiliarity of the new frequency and interpret it as wrongness. The new configuration does not feel like home yet, because it has not been inhabited long enough to carry the texture of familiarity. So the mind reaches back toward the old emotional architecture, because it at least offered a known shape, a recognizable inner landscape, a set of feelings that, however painful, or at least predictable, they will mistake coherence for coldness, repositioning for regression, and signal clearing for emptiness. They will tell themselves that something has gone wrong, precisely at the moment when something has gone profoundly right. The Arcturian field observers track this misinterpretation pattern with painful precision because it is the most common source of unnecessary suffering in the correction phase. Not the correction itself. The correction is clean, structured, and mathematically correct, but the viewer's insistence on calling the correction by the wrong name creates a layer of interpretive friction that the field must then work against as it continues to proceed, and it will continue to proceed. The only variable is how much resistance surrounds it. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary recognition. It is the moment your field stops denying what has already begun. If this transmission put language around something you have been carrying in silence, Arcturian protocol, the recalibration blueprint, was created for this exact stage. It is not another explanation. It is the guided blueprint for those whose field has already entered correction and can no longer return to the old line unchanged. It shows you how to recognize the phases, stabilize the shift, and move through the recalibration without mistaking it for collapse. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. Now let us move through what is actually unfolding in you, phase by phase, with the precision this process deserves. The first thing that happens when a field enters the correction sequence is that the outer life begins to feel slightly unreal, not dramatically, not in a way that would concern a physician or alarm a rational observer, just slightly too familiar, slightly too performed. You move through your own routines and notice something in the background, a quiet awareness that the stage set around you was constructed for a version of you that no longer fully exists. The furniture is the same, the schedule is the same, the conversations follow their predictable arcs, but there is a new quality of observational distance between you and all of it, as if you have moved one layer back from the life you were inhabiting so completely just weeks ago. You watch yourself say the right things, respond in the expected ways, fulfill the familiar roles, and behind all of it, there is a quietness, an inner observer that was not so present before, watching the performance of your own life with a new and slightly bewildering detachment. This is not dissociation. This is the first perceptual consequence of frequency repositioning. The field has moved. The life around you has not yet caught up. The gap you are feeling between yourself and your former architecture is real, it is measurable, and it is correct. The second marker that the Arcturian field diagnostic consistently identifies in this phase is a disruption in the energetic relationship to effort. Things that used to feel worth fighting for no longer generate the same internal mobilization. Projects that once carried urgency now sit in the awareness without igniting the familiar drive to push. Plans that once excited the nervous system now arrive in your awareness with a strange flatness, as if the circuit that connected ambition to activation has been temporarily interrupted. You may interpret this as depression. You may interpret it as loss of purpose, as evidence that you are failing to care about your own life in the way a functioning person should. But what is actually occurring is that the motivational architecture of your old frequency is being decommissioned in real time. The field cannot simultaneously clear the old structure and sustain it. The clearing requires that the old drives lose their charge. The engine that ran on the old fuel cannot simply be refueled while the fuel system is being replaced. This is not the end of direction. This is the suspension of direction while the new vector is being precisely calibrated. The field observers see this phase consistently misread as failure or stagnation. It is not failure. It is the field going deliberately quiet before it goes precisely and powerfully directed. The third thing you may be experiencing is a new quality of relationship to other people's emotional fields. Those who once pulled strongly on your attention, your energy, your emotional resources, now register differently. Their urgency does not penetrate the way it once did. Their distress does not automatically enroll your system in response. Their need for your engagement still arrives, but something in your field meets it with a new steadiness rather than an automatic flood of reaction. You are present. You can hear them, but the old involuntary submersion into their frequency, the way their emotional state used to immediately become your emotional state, no longer happens with the same automaticity. You may feel guilty about this. You may interpret it as growing cold, as losing care, as becoming someone less sensitive or less available to the people you love. The Arcturian diagnosis sees this with complete precision. What has changed is not your capacity for care. What has changed is your susceptibility to frequency invasion. The emotional permeability that once allowed other people's distress to immediately override your own field coherence has been structurally reduced. This is not a personality change. This is a field protection mechanism activating in direct proportion to the new frequency stability requirements. The new configuration requires more internal coherence to maintain than the old one did. The field compensates by becoming less automatically permeable to external dissonance. It is not closing you off from the world. It is protecting the integrity of a calibration that, once destabilized, would have to begin again. The fourth marker is what the Arcturian framework calls temporal dislocation. You begin to feel an unusual relationship to time. Days that once had clear emotional texture begin to feel compressed or indistinguishable. You lose track of how much time has passed since a particular event, not because your memory is failing, but because the emotional markers that usually index time are no longer firing with their old intensity. A week can pass and feel like it left no meaningful impression, not because nothing happened, but because your field is no longer recording events through the emotional circuits of the old architecture. The old circuits stamped events with emotional weight, and that weight created the felt sense of time passing, of life accumulating significance moment by moment. Now those circuits are being rewired. The field is recalibrating what registers as significant, what qualifies as signal, and what is reclassified as background noise. Time feels strange because the system that once gave time its texture is in the middle of being rebuilt. The events are still occurring. Your life is still moving forward, but the way the field processes and encodes that movement has fundamentally changed. The fifth thing, and this is where many people arrive at genuine alarm, is the collapse of the old narrative. The story you had been telling yourself about who you are, where you are going, what you are building, and what your life is supposed to look like begins to lose its internal conviction, not because you have failed at those things, not because the goals were wrong or the path was misguided, but because the narrative was constructed from the interpretive logic of the old frequency, and the old frequency can no longer sustain its architecture within your field. Narratives require a stable, energetic home. They require that the frequency underlying the story remain coherent enough to keep the story feeling true, feeling like yours, feeling like the accurate account of a real trajectory. When the frequency shifts significantly enough, the old narrative begins to feel like someone else's biography. You can still recite it. You can still explain your history and your plans to another person with technical accuracy, but internally, when you reach toward it for the sense of grounded certainty it used to provide, it no longer holds its weight. The words come, but the energetic conviction behind them is gone. This is not an identity crisis in the psychological sense. This is an identity decommissioning in the field sense. The Arcturian observers track this moment with particular precision because it is simultaneously the most disorienting phase and the most structurally significant one. The old narrative was not just a story. It was the primary organizing structure of your old frequency pattern. Its collapse is not a personal catastrophe. It is the clearest evidence available that the new frequency has grown stronger than the old architecture can contain. The sixth marker is what the field diagnostics identify as phantom reaching. You reach, repeatedly and often unconsciously, for something that is no longer there. Not a person necessarily, not a specific thing, but a feeling, a state, a kind of internal weather that used to be your baseline. You reach for the familiar worry, and it does not fully engage. You reach for the familiar excitement, and it arrives diluted, like a frequency too weak to fully occupy the channel it once filled completely. You reach for the familiar dread, and find it curiously muted, present in outline, but absent in weight. You reach for the old anger, the old longing, the old certainty, and what comes back is a quieter signal than the one you expected. The phantom reaching happens because the nervous system has been calibrated to the old frequency for years, in some cases for decades, and it continues to initiate the same habitual searches for states that the old frequency reliably produced. But the old frequency is no longer the active configuration. The states it generated are no longer the field's natural output, and so the reaching continues while the old states become increasingly inaccessible. And the result is a profound sense of strangeness that is not grief and not liberation, but something that exists precisely between the two. The sensation of standing in a room where everything familiar has been quietly removed overnight, and you are not yet sure whether you are supposed to mourn the emptiness or begin to furnish it with something new. Now here is the revelation that needs to land with full weight before this transmission closes. Everything described above, the unreality, the motivational suspension, the changed relationship to others' fields, the disrupted sense of time, the collapsing narrative, the phantom reaching, none of it is evidence that something has gone wrong with you. None of it. Every single marker, taken individually or read as a complete set, is evidence that something has already gone profoundly right at the level of field architecture. The Arcturian field observers do not look at the person experiencing coherence rupture and see someone in crisis. They see someone whose field has successfully executed a phase transition that most fields do not reach. The difficulty you are living through is not the consequence of failure. It is the consequence of having crossed a threshold that requires a complete restructuring of your relationship to your own inner life, and that restructuring is, by its nature, temporarily disorienting. The disorientation you are feeling is not the disorientation of collapse. It is the disorientation of someone standing inside a new structure whose walls are still being erected while they are living inside it, trying to navigate rooms that do not yet have their final shape, moving through corridors that are still being constructed around them in real time. The process did not ask for your permission because it did not need it. The field executes correction according to patterns that have been in motion far longer than the 48-hour window this transmission named. What completed recently was not the beginning of the process. It was the confirmation of it, the completion point, the moment when the new frequency achieved enough internal coherence that the old architecture finally registered its own incompatibility and began to release its structural hold. The release is what you have been calling confusion, heaviness, detachment, or quiet breakdown. But the Arcturian frame sees it with complete clarity. Release is not breakdown. Release is the field making room for the next coherent structure to take form. You cannot build the next architecture on top of the old one while the old one is still load-bearing. The old one must lose its structural integrity first. That loss is painful. That loss is disorienting. That loss is completely real in its lived experience. And that loss is exactly correct. What you are being asked to do right now is not to accelerate the process, not to force the clarity before it arrives, not to manufacture the next phase through willpower or spiritual discipline or anxious forward motion. What you are being asked to do is stop calling correction by the wrong name. Stop calling the clearing emptiness. Stop calling the signal shift failure. What is moving through your life right now is not a punishment handed down for something you did wrong. It is a precision event. It was already mapped, already tracked, already identified in its phases before it became visible to you. And the fact that it is happening now, at this speed, at this completeness, means your field achieved something that placed it ahead of its own projected schedule. Repeat this if it reaches you with weight behind it. What is changing in me is not random. That statement is not comfort. It is a field-level recalibration of the interpretive lens through which you are reading your own experience. because how you interpret this process will determine how much resistance the field has to move through in order to complete its next stabilization. Resistance does not stop the correction. Nothing stops the correction once it has crossed the coherence rupture point. But resistance extends the period of incoherence. It prolongs the gap between the old architecture's full release and the new architecture's full stabilization. It keeps you living longer inside the disorientation, because the field has to continuously work against the friction of your own misinterpretation to proceed. The Arcturian observers watch this with deep and precise attention. Not judgment, never judgment, but unflinching attention. Because every moment you spend calling correction by the name of catastrophe is a moment the field must spend moving around your interpretive framework rather than moving cleanly through it. You are not brought to this transmission to be comforted. You are brought here to be precisely recognized. There is a fundamental difference between those two things. Comfort asks the experience to feel better before it is understood. Recognition asks you to see the experience with enough clarity that the comfort becomes unnecessary. Because what you feared was wrongness, and what you now see is precision. Seeing clearly from inside an active correction phase is not passive. It is the most active thing you can do. It reduces the friction. It allows the field to complete its work without the additional labor of moving through layers of misidentified catastrophe. Not action, not forced next steps, not performance of the change for the benefit of anyone watching your outer life. Seeing, recognizing, holding what is happening with the interpretive frame it has always deserved, rather than the one that shame and confusion and the pressure to be okay have been pressing onto it. The field has already moved. The 72 hours of calibration are underway. What comes after the calibration is not a return to what was. There is no return available from this side of the threshold. What comes after is the first full activation of the frequency pattern your field has been working toward beneath the surface of everything you thought was simply your ordinary life, beneath the routines and the relationships and the plans and the quiet, persistent sense that something was building in you that you could not yet see or name, that something has now crossed its completion point. It is no longer building, it has built. And what you are living through right now is the first hours of standing inside it before your outer life has had time to reflect what your field already knows. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this process has already touched your life. It could be your sleep, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, or the strange sense that reality no longer feels the same. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who is living through a shift they cannot explain. And if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it, subscribe to Arcturian Quantum. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a process already in motion, and this is only the beginning.